Thank you, everyone, for sticking around to hear a little bit about elder law and long-term care costs and some ways that we can look to offset some of those costs. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some estate planning, things that you should be doing today, especially if you're confronting the issues of aging and illness. And as we all get older, we want to be prepared for those changes. So as they said, my name is John Griffin. I'm a board-certified elder law attorney here in town. And what that means is how we differ from a traditional estate planner is that we do a little more focus on what happens when we confront those issues of illness and aging, right? A lot of estate planning is very general, but we're looking at what happens if we have to be in a scenario where we're looking for Medicaid assistance in a skilled nursing or VA assistance, or some of those aspects about costs that are not generally addressed in a traditional estate plan. So let's look a little bit at the numbers here. When you look at the risks of dementia, you can see that according to the Alzheimer's Association, 50% of people over 85 have already been diagnosed with some form of dementia, right? So that's 1 in 2 of us is going to have a dementia diagnosis by the time we're 85. And when we look at that as far as planning, right, the odds of a house fire are extremely rare, right? 0.3% of us are ever going to experience a house fire. But most of us, when we owned a home, right, we protected our home from that risk. Yet 50% of us are going to get dementia, and very few of us have done the planning to address that potential risk and cost. So when we look at what that means 1 in 7 people in Sarasota County have already been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And that's just Alzheimer's, not to mention things like Parkinson's and other illnesses. So the risks here are real. So let's talk a little bit about what happens when we age and we need to find a place to live, right? There are a couple of options that are available to us. The number one place we typically start is going to be staying at home. Now, living at home is, generally what people want to extend as long as possible. That's the number one thing we hear. And what does that mean, though, if you start to age, get ill? What is that going to mean for you as far as costs? Well, home health care, and I'm being a little generous here, actually, I think, because I think the numbers have gone up since I did these numbers even earlier in the year. Average cost of home health care, those I said around $30 an hour. That can be now upwards of $35 and $35 an hour. When I started practicing 22 years ago, that was $15 to $18 an hour. So it has risen dramatically in the last couple of decades. But when we look at cost, 24 hours a day times 30 hours times 30 days in a month is about $21,600 a month for 24-hour home health care. So that's $260,000 a year. That is out of reach for most people, right? Most people are not going to be able to spend that kind of money for 24-hour home health care. And so when we talk about the goal of wanting to stay home, we do have to look at the real aspect of that, which is, can I afford it? The other part about staying home that can be so difficult is the caregiver stress, right? If we have someone at home to provide some of that care, the Alzheimer's Association will say that I think it's 62% of caregivers fail to survive the people they're caring for. And that's typically tied to stress, right? For a dementia patient, for example, every day can be Groundhog's Day, right? They wake up, the worries of yesterday are forgotten, and they're going about minute by minute. But for that caregiver, the stress piles on and on and on, and they don't forget all of the struggles that they see their loved one going through and that they themselves are experiencing, and guilt when you get angry, and stress and worry, and you can't sleep because your loved one doesn't sleep at night anymore. And so all of these things start to pile on and make it very difficult for a caregiver to provide that care. So we're always cautioning people to make sure that when you look at the caregivers versus the need of the care recipient, to make sure you're putting that on a scale, right? If it's all tipped to the person needing care and nothing is going to the caregiver, That's not a situation that's going to be sustainable long term. And the risk, of course, is if you survive it, you're both going to end up in the facility. And then we're going to have double the need and double the expense. So living at home, obviously a preferred option, but one that can be extremely expensive if around-the-clock care is needed. Next option is assisted living. There are really two levels of assisted living now, generally speaking. There are some breakdowns in that even, but when I started practicing, there was assisted living. And that was basically an apartment that you had where they would provide some care, and you could usually pay a la carte for more services as you needed them in your apartment. That's kind of what assisted living was when I started practicing. Since then, and basically feels like on just about every corner, they have now added memory care, which is a level of assisted living typically that includes a lockdown, a higher level of care, sometimes a flat rate fee, but it is a more intensive level of assisted living, but doesn't rise to the level of skilled nursing. And when we look at costs for traditional assisted living, those can range now from $3,500 a month to $6,500 a month. That's for a relatively low need situation. And then for memory care, that ranges typically from $5,500 a month at the low end up to $9,000, sometimes $10,000 a month for memory care. So again, to look at that comparatively, when I started practicing law 20 years ago, average cost of nursing home care was about $6,500 a month. Is what we averaged. So you can see how now even assisted living, the lower level of care, has almost usurped that or doubled what they were paying for nursing home care. So when we look at the difference between assisted living and skilled, one of the big ways I like to describe the difference is when you walk through an assisted living, it feels like an apartment building, right? All the doors are closed, everybody has their own individual rooms. And when you walk through a skilled nursing, all the doors are open. It feels more like a hospital setting where the nurses are coming in and out at leisure. In an assisted living facility, it's typically, they're going to knock on the door, see what you're doing, see if you need help. In a skilled, they're going to be coming in and checking on you actively throughout the day without any necessarily prompting. So a lot of folks want to put their loved one in an assisted living memory care when we get to, when we're talking about dementia or something like that, because it feels nicer, right? It feels like you go and you have a little room and you have this place. But the reality is it's not right for a lot of people. And we're often having to have that conversation with families, which is it appropriate to be in assisted living or skilled? Does your level of care exceed what an assisted living really should be providing? Because it is not designed to just leave you alone all day. If you can't be left alone, for large chunks of the day, then assisted living may not be the appropriate setting for you anymore. And so we really do want to look at that. With no disrespect to the assisted living memory care facilities, they often promise a lot, and deliver less than that. So you really do want to, the most expensive room for them is an empty room. So a lot of times they'll evaluate your loved one, say, yeah, we can have them in to the assisted living, and you as the caregiver or loved one find that you're still having to provide a lot of services on top of what they can provide because it isn't skilled care. People want the skilled care level in the assisted living setting, but that's just unfortunately not how they're set up. So we do want to be more honest with ourselves sometimes when we're looking at what is available. The next level of care is skilled nursing. That is going to be if you've ever had rehab, right? Typically outside of a place like Encompass, which someone was talking about earlier, which is a hospital setting. Most rehabs, though, like the Pines, like Manor Care, well, it's not Manor Care anymore, they change their names all the time, right? All these rehab facilities where I broke my hip, I went to a facility to get rehab, those are all also going to serve typically as skilled nursing facilities. So they're going to have a rehab wing and a long-term care wing, both of which are providing roughly similar levels of care, although you're going to receive more intensive rehab in the rehab facility than you are in the long-term care. But it's really designed as a 24-hour nursing facility to provide all your needs no matter what they are, in a skilled setting. So you are often looking at folks who have the highest levels of care. Typically, we're looking at several activities of daily living before you're in a skilled facility. So dressing, bathing, toileting, personal hygiene, walking, transferring up and down out of a chair or bed. Those are all what we call activities of daily living. And that's what they're looking at to see where you qualify on this spectrum of care. Average cost of a nursing home here is going to be somewhere between $10,000 and $15,000 a month for that level of care. And that depends in part on where you're going and what your interests are. So between $120,000 and $180,000 a year, depending on your needs. Now, the good news, and part of what we're going to talk about in a minute, is how do we pay for some of these things, right? So if we don't have an extra $180,000 lying around, what do we do to cover those costs of long-term care? Where is the government going to help us out, and what do we do to qualify? So I like to throw up a fourth option there, set sail, right? Cruise ship option. According to when I did this numbers, it was about $100 a night per person to do a cruise, which only averages out to about $3,042 a month for a double room. So, you and your spouse can go on a cruise for $6,000 a month. There you'll get steaks, lobsters, entertainment, casinos, port to port. So that is a good option for those of you looking not to go into assisted living. Consider that cruise ship. So how do we pay for all this, right? One option is most of us in the room who are over 65 probably have Medicare, right? But Medicare is health insurance, not long-term care insurance, right? Medicare just replaced our Blue Cross Blue Shield or whatever we had when we were working. And so it's not designed to cover all those extra expenses if we need what we call custodial care. And Medicare typically is only going to cover up to 100 days if you have traditional Medicare with a supplement. So up to 100 days of coverage. They will pay on traditional 20%, 100% of the first 20 days, then 20% of the next 80 days for rehabilitation services. If you have a traditional Medicare supplement, that supplement is typically going to pay the other 80% of those 80 days, covering you for up to 100 days of coverage for that kind of rehab. So post-broken hip, post-stroke, post-episode, post-whatever medical event caused you to be hospitalized, needing to go to a rehab to be treated, with Medicare and a traditional supplement, you're usually covered for about 100 days. If you do not have a traditional Medicare supplement and you have to pay the copay, that's typically set at $209 a day for those 80 days, which comes out to about $16,700 of out-of-pocket cost if you do not have a traditional supplement to cover that rehab. So that is why I want to point out that there are also Medicare Advantage plans that are alternate to traditional Medicare supplements. And for those of us in this room or listening on Zoom who have illnesses, we want to be thinking about whether or not a Medicare Advantage plan is our best option. Because a lot of times the person who's selling you that Medicare Advantage plan at CVS or over the phone doesn't really have your best interest at heart. No offense to CVS, I don't want to get a letter. Wherever you meet them, they may not have your best interest at heart. And so it's important to understand, what did I give up when I switched to a Medicare Advantage plan? It's not usually dollar for dollar the same benefits, right? You're paying less for the Medicare Advantage and you're giving something up. And one of the things they often have you give up is your coverage for those rehab days. So, or at least a portion of them. So maybe they only cover 10 days, maybe they cover 20 days, but they don't cover the full 100 days very often, a lot of times. And so that may mean that you're out of pocket this cost here, or a portion of it. And so if you're saving $100 a month by switching to a Medicare Advantage plan, but it's costing you $15,000 the minute you break that hip or have a stroke, you have not made a good economic deal. So do know, if you do have a Medicare Advantage plan, what did you give up from a traditional supplement when you switched to that plan, right? That free gym membership that they often throw out there, or free eyeglasses, you can get a lot of gym and a lot of glasses for $16,000. So make sure you've made a good decision there. Medicare, like I said, does not pay for any custodial care. So if you need care beyond that rehab, Medicare stops. They will not pay for it, which means your supplement typically is not going to pay for it, and you are then in a private pay situation. So when we look at private pay, right, obviously everybody in town takes money, right? So every nursing home, every facility will just be glad to let you pay until you can't pay anymore. And they're going to use they'll take everything you've got, right? They'll take your IRAs, they'll take your real estate, they'll take your cash. Everything you own potentially falls into the private pay situation. Now, one of the risks I like to throw out there when we're looking at private pay, because some people say, well, I can pay for it, right? I've got this much income and I think I can pay for it with my assets. We do have to remember that that's more of a cliff than a hill, right? Because if we start spending our assets to pay for care, and those assets are generating income, as we spend the assets, we make less income, which means we have to spend more assets and make less income. And eventually, it's going to drop off much sharper potentially than a slow and steady rate of decline. Also, I was talking earlier about long-term care insurance, which I've had since I was in my 30s, right? My wife and I, this is what we do. So we see the risks, right? You don't have to be old to have Alzheimer's or dementia or a car accident or a stroke. And so we got it in our 30s. And when we bought, I think, $8,000 worth of coverage, which was more than enough to cover the nursing home. Plus we bought an inflation rider at 5% a year for every year it goes up. And we thought, oh, we'll be fine, right? That'll cover us. We should be good. We have, in the many years since then, we maybe have a little over $11,000 worth of coverage now, but the average nursing home is running up to $15,000. So the cost of care itself has outpaced that 5% inflation rate. So now we are underinsured, even though at the time we were overinsured. And so we do just want to be thinking about, when we look at, yes, I can afford it, is that on today's dollars? Is that on 5 years from now's dollars? We want to be looking at those potential risks. So option number 2, yes, long-term care. Like I said, I have it. It's good if you can get it, but if you need it, you can't get it, right? So a lot of the folks in this room who maybe already have a diagnosis, just about if anybody's ever seen a doctor and they've written something in your chart, right? They don't want to give you insurance once they think you're going to use it. They're in the you die without ever using it business. That's how they make money. And so what I like to say is, yes, it's great if you can get it, but many people can't. If you do have it, there are a couple things we want to look at. How much coverage does it provide, right? So I mentioned earlier we had coverage. We thought we were good. Let's say I think ours is probably enough to cover $350 a day of a nursing home, right? But now if that cost is $425, that means I'm out the other $75. I've got to come up with the difference between what I'm covered for and what I pay. So some people have older policies they come show us that are, oh, I have long-term care insurance. Okay, well, it's $100 a day, which is better than nothing, but not going to be that helpful in paying for long-term care costs in a skilled nursing. Where we would see that as a potential benefit is at home, right? If I have $100 a day, I can hire, our lunch sponsor, Brightstar, to come in at $100 a day and provide, 3-4 hours maybe of care for that amount of money, but it isn't going to cover me in the nursing home setting. It might offset, $3,000 a month of my assisted living bill, which is a big help. But if that bill is $5,500 a month, I've got to make sure I've got the resources to cover the difference. So the amount of coverage is important. The next one is, how long will I be covered, right? 3 years, 5 years, 2 years, lifetime? The policies are all different based on what you contracted for when you got that and what you're paying for. So you do have to know how long you're covered, right? If the average stay used to be 3 years, now I think it's a little higher than that as our life expectancies increase. will I be covered for 3 years? Will I be covered for 5? Am I covered for life? That makes a big difference, right? About how you're going to be able to afford to pay for this. Do you have that inflation protection? So I mentioned I have a 5% inflation. What I bought 15 years ago is not going to be the same as what I have to pay for today. So that inflation rider becomes real important to protect those costs. So you need to know what you bought and what you have today. Often you can only find that out by calling the company or checking your annual information to see what you've got. So talking to someone a little earlier about this elimination period. When does it start, right? If I have a episode that is short-term, my personal long-term care has a 90-day elimination period. So I'm privately paying for those 90 days. It doesn't cover until I've spent 90 days on private care. So you have to look and see how much are you going to be out of pocket, and do you have the means to cover that period to get through that elimination period. And then understanding the levels of care, and I can look at that 2 ways. What is the trigger that causes this policy to go into effect? Every policy, it's contractual, so every policy is a little different, but you need to know from your policy, is it when I need assistance showering, meaning someone's got to be standing there helping me soap up and turn the water on, or is it I need reminders showering, right? Somebody's got to be there to say, hey, if nobody was here, I wouldn't shower or dress or bathe, or I'd wear yesterday's clothes, or do I need help putting on that shirt? Different policies have different interpretations of some of those levels of care, so you need to know what level of care your insurance requires. And then I would also say what level of care it supports. So my policy is a newer policy relative to long-term care, and so ours is home health, assisted, and skilled, basically all anticipated levels of care. I wanted it to say robots just in case, but it doesn't. But I think that might be coming at some point, right? So what level of care, when will they pay for it? What do I need? Some older policies are just nursing home policies. So you're only covered if you're in that skilled level of care. It's not providing that home health care. So you need to know that so that you know when to start triggering your benefits. And the other thing I like to say is don't let it sit. If you have it, use it, right? Because they're hoping you never use it, right? That's their business. So if you find that you have a need, sometimes we're working with home health care companies to provide a very low level of care at home once you meet the medical criteria to trigger that elimination period. Let's use those 90 days, sorry, I forget, her name escapes me. Sally. No, the woman who's here, Drew Brown from Bright Star was mentioning they don't have a minimum benefit, right? So we may want to start with, working with someone like Drew to start 1 or 2 hours a day to get very minimal care. But under your policy, if that uses up one of your elimination days, that means you can get through your 90 days of your elimination period, potentially using Bright Star or someone like them that has no minimum, so that you can then get to your coverage period and then increase your services with Drew once you're in your covered period, right? So planning how you use that long-term care insurance can be real important, and using that benefit of something like a minimum service really can help minimize your out-of-pocket costs by using up your 90 days of elimination. So that's long-term care. Like I said, it's great if you have it, but if you don't, you can't get it once you need it. So don't be looking for that as an out when the need arises. Next option, VA benefits. VA benefits are a great option if you qualify. In order to qualify, you have to have been discharged under other than dishonorable service generally. So, any kind of discharge is generally accepted so long as it's under honorable conditions. And your time of service does matter for the benefit I'm going to talk about. I'm going to talk about aid and attendance, which is sort of, in some respects, the Cadillac of home health care benefits that are available. You have to have served at least 1 day during a period of war. So you don't have to have served in the war arena. you simply had to have served during a period. So if you were peeling potatoes in the Tampa Bay while the war was going on somewhere, your service qualifies because you are a wartime veteran. And so when we look at those war dates, we want to make sure that you look at the exact dates that the VA and the government uses, not what you think of as the war. Because, for example, the Gulf War, in essence, we've been in a constant state of war since the Gulf War broke out. So every veteran who served from the 90s to today is a wartime veteran, even though we may not think of ourselves in the same kind of active war state that we did during World War II or during Vietnam or Korea. Every veteran who served during this period is a wartime veteran. And then we want to look at the financial criteria for that. In 2025, generally speaking, for aid and attendance, you have to have $159,000 roughly of countable assets for VA benefits to qualify. And the VA changed the rules in 2018 to make it much more difficult to get VA benefits. We used to be able to do a lot of different planning options to move monies around and get people eligible. That's much harder to do now without planning a couple of years in advance. So the VA does impose a 36-month look-back period for transfers out of your name to another. So again, you may want to be looking at planning far enough in advance, right? When you get the diagnosis, you may want to be looking at, should I be planning, versus once the need for that care arises. Because once the need for the care arises, it may be too late or it may be too long before you get those services. So don't hesitate, if you think you qualify for this benefit, to start early in that planning. When we look at VA aid and attendance benefit, it is a cash benefit. So what that means is if you qualify, the VA is going to send you a tax-free check to help cover or offset all or some of your costs. And those numbers are up here. For a single veteran, that's $23.58 a month. For a married veteran, that's $27.95 a month. For the surviving spouse, that's $15.50 a month. I do have if the ill spouse is up here. That's a little more complicated because it's not aid and attendance, it's a different benefit. But if you're a surviving spouse of a veteran, an extra $1,500 a month to pay for home health care or to offset that assisted living bill can be very helpful. But again, a little more complicated formula because they look at both income and assets to determine your eligibility. So in essence, you have to have typically unreimbursed medical expense is probably the best way to describe it in order to get this benefit. So if you're spending all of your income on medical, they will give you this amount. If you're spending less than all of your income on medical, they may reduce this amount by your excess income. So again, a complicated formula, but if you're in an assisted living and you make $3,000 a month and it's $5,000 a month and you're a surviving spouse, then you spend all your money on care. They will then give you that $1,500 to offset your additional expense, as an idea of how that works. Medically speaking, the VA is a little more generous than Medicaid is. They typically have a lower level of care needed. I like to describe it generally as you can't be left alone safely as the criteria. So if you need someone there queuing, hey, it's time to shower, it's time to eat, it's time to do these things, that shirt's on backwards, but you can physically do some of those things yourself, you may still qualify for VA benefit where you may not qualify for the Medicaid benefit under those same circumstances. So know that the medical criteria is a little different, with the VA being a little more generous than Medicaid. So let's talk then a little bit about skilled care. Skilled care, Medicaid as a means for paying for skilled care. Now, Medicaid, I can only speak of as of today, as the rules exist at this moment, right? We are anticipating some changes may be coming to the services and the criteria and all of that. Nobody knows what those might be, but some recent legislation and cuts we expect to trickle down to the Medicaid program here. But Medicaid can be one of the most generous programs for someone facing skilled care in that it can potentially cover up to 100% of that skilled nursing home care cost. So if I'm in that $15,000 a month nursing home and I am married, it is possible that we could protect 100% of the assets and potentially 100% of the income under that circumstance. So that's an amazing benefit that might be available if you qualify, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it could be that that $15,000 cost is not something we need to worry about. Now in Florida, our Medicaid program also covers some home health care and some assisted living costs under what we call home and community-based services program. Pros and cons, or good news, bad news, right? We were one of only 2 states, I believe, that did not take what you may have heard of as Medicaid expansion. Back when Rick Scott was governor, he declined federal money to expand Medicaid to provide more services to Florida. The bad news there was we didn't get a lot of the help the other states get for home and community-based services. So some other states are much more generous than Florida is as far as providing home health care or offsetting assisted living costs. The good news, we hope, is that we may not feel the pinch as much from these Medicaid cuts because we think a lot of that money may come from the Medicare expansion that happened. So the money we didn't take, they'll be pulling back. So maybe we won't be as badly impacted by these changes, although time will tell. We don't know that for sure. But if we want to look at home and community-based services, so assistance at a home health level, we want to know that if I needed nursing home care tomorrow and I qualify for Medicaid, I can get started services immediately, right? So if I qualify in October and I apply in October, I can get coverage for October. For home and community-based services, whether that's in assisted living or at home, there's a wait list for that program. I could be 3 months or 3 years on that wait list. I heard at one point there was as many as 40,000 people. Some people say that's 80,000. We don't know how many people are actually on the wait list. But the complicated part about the wait list is it really doesn't matter how many people are on it because you don't know where you'll end up on it. When you go on to home and community-based services program wait list, they put you in based on need, not time. Now, I recommend getting on as early as possible so you can get a representative and call back when things change. But you might go on a level 5, right? And so you may be, even though you've just come on the list, you may skip everyone who's has a lower need than you have. So it's based on, they assess you and they determine your need and they put you on there. So today you could go on at number 40,000 and tomorrow you could be 40,001 if they put someone above you on the need level. So understanding that home and community-based services is not something that's typically going to be immediately available is important because a lot of times when you go to assisted living facilities and they say, well, we take Medicaid, you have to know that you can't rely on when that program might be available to you to get that financial assistance. So just be wary of that. In the home health level, typically somewhere between 10 and 20 hours is what we tell people to expect to get a week of services if you get approved for home health care at home through the home and community-based services. That is an HMO style program, so there is no definitive answer of how much service you're going to get. They want to provide you as little service as possible for the dollars they're getting. You want as much service as possible for the dollars they're being paid. So it becomes a little bit of a negotiation to try to get as much care as you can, but know that it provides some help, but it's really there, I would say, as a relief to the caregiver, not as a complete, you're not typically going to get 24-hour home health care to stay out of a nursing home. It's going to be, hey, your caregiver needs 12 hours, 2 6-hour days to go and do all the things they need to do. So we're going to send in home health care to cover you during that period. So let's talk about eligibility for any of those 3 programs. The eligibility is the same. You have to meet the health criteria, which I mentioned earlier are the activities of daily living: dressing, bathing, toileting, walking, personal hygiene, eating. Typically for Medicaid, they're going to want to see some hands-on help, that you need physical assistance in those things, not simply that you forget to do them. If you have a diagnosis of dementia with whatever illness you have, you need 2 activities of daily living. If you do not have a diagnosis of dementia, it's typically 3 activities of daily living before you would meet the medical criteria for Medicaid. So know that. And then I also like to say, when we talk about health, a lot of folks will come in and see me and I'll say, so tell me, what are you getting help with? Well, my loved one's pretty good, pretty good. I say, okay, so if you were to go away for 3 days, I'd never go away for 3 days. Okay, well, if you went away for 3 days, what would that look like, right? Would they dress, bathe, toilet, eat? Could they get up and down out of a chair reliably? Would they know yesterday's clothes from today's clothes, right? It's important to sort of really look at the situation and determine, not through the love that we have for our person we're caring for, but through the real eyes of other people, what kind of care do I need? And it's important to be having that conversation with yourself before you get on the phone with Medicaid to describe the situation. Because if you say, oh, they're pretty good, and they do this and this and this, even though that's maybe not reality, you're going to get down at the bottom of the list. And so it's really important to address it as if you weren't there, what would they look like and what kind of care would they get? So health-wise, again, need those assistance with some of those activities of daily living. Income-wise, Florida is what we call an income cap state for Medicaid, which means there is a upper limit of financial eligibility, sort of, right? So $2,901 a month is the maximum income that Medicaid says you can get. But that's not actually true, right? Because if I'm in a $12,000 a month nursing home and I make $2,800 a month or $3,000 a month, right, just over that limit, I don't have enough to get Medicaid, but I certainly can't pay for a $12,000 a month nursing home. So really what that means is Medicaid makes you jump through a hoop in Florida called a qualified income trust. And all that really means to you is we're going to open a new bank account backed by a trust document. And every month we're going to move the excess money into the account, and generally every month it's going to come back out. I like to say it's like government ordered money laundering, right? They say you make too much money, but if you put it in this new account, it goes in dirty, it comes out clean. Now, depending where that money goes, it's either going to go as a copay to the nursing home, potentially if you're a single person, or maybe it's going to come back to your spouse if you're married, depending on your financial situation and what options we have. A lot of times we can get income turned back over to the well spouse, and I'll talk about that in a second. But know that there is a listed an income cap, but so long as you can jump through that qualified income trust hoop, that income cap will not be a block to your coverage. But where that becomes really important is, in order to create that qualified income trust, it's an irrevocable trust under Florida law. You have to have the specific authorities in a power of attorney to do that. And so if you are working with a power of attorney that wasn't done by an elder law attorney or was done by an attorney and it's not adequate, which unfortunately a lot of them are not, or you're dealing with an out-of-state power of attorney that may not have those authorities, you may find that you do not have adequate authority to create that qualified income trust when the time comes. So really, as a pre-planning stage, right, anyone who's listening should recognize that power of attorney becomes really one of the most important pieces in this planning process. To allow us to get you eligible for these kind of benefits, a very strong, very powerful power of attorney becomes essential to that process. So if you take anything away from this seminar at all, it's that having a good power of attorney can open all of these doors and solve all of these headaches down the line. Because without a good power of attorney, we may find ourselves without the ability to do these things, which means you're in a private pay situation or you can't create the qualified income trust, and so you're out of pocket and potentially losing tens of thousands of dollars of potential coverage. Asset-wise, in Florida, you can have roughly, if you're the applicant, you have to have $2,000 or less for Medicaid coverage. If you're a married person, you can have roughly $158,000 in assets or less. That's only of countable assets. So that does not include IRAs, typically, if you're taking a distribution. It does not include one car. It does not include your home. It does not include group life insurance. So there are things that are not counted in those numbers that are potential exclusions to that limit. So don't look at that limit and say, I don't qualify, right? Because if I had $1 million IRA and $2,000 in the bank, I could still potentially be qualified for Medicaid. Okay, so don't assume automatically that you wouldn't qualify. We really want to look at your assets and see what we can do. There are also a lot of planning strategies that we have, we'll talk a little bit more about, but there are a lot of planning strategies to get families into these limits legally within Florida law, again, provided we have the right authorities and a power of attorney and things like that. Now, I do want to throw something out which I didn't address earlier, which is I'm using the term Medicaid, which a lot of us have a reaction to, right? I don't want to be in a Medicaid facility, right? I don't know what that means, but I don't like it, right? The only time I ever hear about Medicaid is on the news, and it's talking about low-income families, unwed mothers, children, people who can't afford care, and I don't want to end up in a facility like that because I can't afford it. But the reality is in Sarasota County, I think there are 3, maybe 4 exceptions now, but nearly every facility takes Medicaid. And every Medicaid in a skilled nursing setting is typically going to provide a semi-private room. So like many rehabs, 2 to a room, or many facilities like a hospital room, 2 to a room. But you would not know if your neighbor is paying $15,000 or on Medicaid for that same bed. Same bed, same facilities, same nurses, same wing. You are generally not going to know the difference between someone who's privately paying versus who's on Medicaid coverage. So know that at least here locally, we are often not having to compromise where we are at because we are private pay or because we're Medicaid versus private pay. Now, again, you could pay for that private room. You do have those options. Even on Medicaid, sometimes family members can pay that difference between a private room rate and a Medicaid reimbursement rate to the facility out of pocket if you do want a private room. But typically, you're not having to give up a quality of care to be on Medicaid, and I think that's an important thing to point out. So when we look at those eligibility standards, if you are single, we are looking at these top 3, right? These are the 3 I just covered: health, income, assets. If you're married, we're going to add on a couple of other things. If you're married, there's no health requirement, so they don't look at your health so long as you're not getting Medicaid services, and I'll get out of the way. Income-wise, there is no income limit for a spouse. So if I'm married and I make $6,000 a month and my wife makes $1,500 a month and she needs nursing home care, she would be below the income limit, so she would qualify. My income doesn't count, so I get to keep my $6,000 a month without any eligibility criteria, and we would theoretically qualify on the income side. If that is turned around, though, and I make $6,000 and she makes $1,500 and I need nursing home care, then I'm going to be over the income limit. So I'm going to need to have a qualified income trust to funnel that money through that account. Then potentially I can divert some or all of my income back to my spouse to cover her care. Medicaid has a basic rule that says, a certain amount can go to your spouse to bring her up to a minimum income level. So maybe she'd get $1,000 of my income automatically. But let's say we have $5,000 a month in expenses, right? We've been married a long time. Suddenly I'm turning my income over to a nursing home, leaving her with nothing. We can do something through the marital court, through the divorce court, if you will, that allows us to get alimony for my spouse without the divorce. So it's spousal support not connected to divorce, where we can, again, with the right powers and a power of attorney, important aspect, she can, in essence, sue me for enough money to keep her in the standard of living to which she was living prior to my placement in a facility. And so what that does is it allows me to divert that income back over to my spouse as much as she needs to cover monthly expenses, reducing my copay at the facility down to the difference, which might be zero. And so, again, we have a lot of options here in Florida to deal with that, but that power of attorney becomes real important to authorize all of these types of authorities. Asset-wise, applicant has to have $2,000 or less, married $157,920 or less in assets, but we have a lot of strategies. Let me see, I don't think a couple. So in Florida, if you are over that limit, sometimes even if you're over that limit by a lot, there are things we can do. Florida recognizes is probably one of the most generous states in the country for Medicaid planning, which is a little counterintuitive because we also have one of the highest need-based populations for these benefits. But, right, when it comes down to it, who votes? In Florida, right, we don't put as much money into schools, but we do put money into this program. And so that means we are more generous than other places. And there are options like income-reducing property strategies that allow us to invest excess resources into rental properties, making that money disappear for Medicaid purposes. There are strategies called spousal refusal, where a spouse can simply refuse to pay for the care and have any money in their name or that is turned over to them not count for Medicaid purposes. There's annuity planning for married couples that allow us to move money out of one spouse's name into the name of the other, converting it to an income stream, which then becomes not countable for the well spouse. So a lot of different strategies. I don't want to go into too much detail about them because it's overwhelming, but never assume you don't qualify. If even folks with potentially millions of dollars could still qualify for these benefits legally. What I like to say about Medicaid is everything we do out in the open, right? You're nice people, but I won't go to jail for you. So everything we do is within the rules that Medicaid sets. And, Warren Buffett once said, right, my secretary pays more taxes than I do, percentage-wise, right? Because they know the rules, right? They're sort of the rules for the people who know and the rules for the rest of us who don't know how to do that. And so we want to put you in the know, make sure that you're not paying for things that the government would otherwise provide for you within the rules that they have established. Now, all of the things I've talked about today are Florida specific. Medicaid is a part federal, part state program. So I was talking a little earlier about when we rejected Medicaid expansion, right? So every state has some say in how they apply the federal Medicaid program. And it's complicated, but in essence, there are 50 different programs in the United States. And so if you're here and your kids take you back to Ohio, you're going to be looking at a very different Medicaid program in Ohio than you are here. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, each of these states, are potentially more difficult than Florida in that eligibility criteria, in those rules, in how they penalize transfers, things like that. So it's important, I always like to say, to tell your kids now, tell anyone who might take you somewhere, to know what the rules are of the place they're taking you before they just up and move you. Because I'm assuming some of the folks in here have Parkinson's, right? If you have a spouse or a caregiver and that caregiver or spouse dies, it might be your inclination for your kids or that next caregiver to swoop you up out of here and take you up north. Well, you could be looking at very different rules up there, which could be economically much more devastating. One I point out specifically is Pennsylvania. I believe Pennsylvania still has what we call familial responsibility laws, which say your kids could be sued for the costs of your care, potentially. So they need to know that and understand if they might be liable for your care if they bring you up to a place like Pennsylvania. And, are they prepared to spend $180,000 of their money a year on that nursing home if they got sued by the state of Pennsylvania? So just know that it's worth it to consult with a lawyer before they bring you up somewhere, because it just may not be economically wise to do so. So again, Medicaid has a lot of options. The one thing a lot of people do know is Medicaid does have a 5-year look back. Some people think it's 3 years. That used to be, now it's 5 years. That 5-year look back means they have the ability to look back 5 years to see everything you've done and determine if they still think you're eligible based on what you did. So again, with proper planning though, that 5-year look back doesn't mean anything right now. Under the options we have now, we could get somebody eligible. If one of you came into my office tomorrow and said, my loved one's in a nursing home, I'm privately paying, what can I do? Typically, we still have strategies that could get them eligible. Typically 30 to 60 days is what we're looking at from an eligibility perspective. So there is no need to worry about that 5-year look back. The 5-year look back is really designed to penalize transfers out of your name to members outside of your marriage. Okay, so if I'm married, there is no 5-year look back. If I have $1 million today and my wife had 0, I could give her the $1 million today and there's no look back for that transfer. Medicaid does not penalize interspousal transfers. If I did the same thing and gave it to my daughter, now it's a 5-year look back, right? Medicaid's going to say you could have had that money to pay for your care, you gave it away, now you do not qualify for Medicaid. So know that the 5-year look back may not matter. A lot of kids will say, oh, mom, dad, you can be giving me 15, 18, people use different numbers, $1,000 a year and it doesn't count, right? That is true from an estate tax perspective, but it is not true for Medicaid. So that 15, what people think is 15, but that annual federal tax exemption is not applicable for Medicaid purposes. So don't be starting, those $15,000, $19,000 gifts thinking you're going to be okay. They would still count for Medicaid. And for most of you, you don't need to be giving those gifts if you have an estate less than $15 million as a single person. Come January 1, that'll be the estate tax limit federally, indexed to inflation. So if you have less than 15 million, giving those kind of gifts to avoid estate tax, probably not relevant to your particular circumstance. That's 30 million for a married couple. So not most people need to even worry about that anymore in Florida. So what should we be doing today? I talked a little bit about this earlier. To me, the most important aspect of your estate plan is going to be your power of attorney. In 2011, Florida updated their power of attorney statutes to make it more difficult to do some of this planning in advance without a good power of attorney. They want to make it more difficult for people to qualify, so they put some new rules in place. So if your power of attorney is older, it may not qualify with some of these strategies. If you saw an attorney who doesn't specialize in elder law, they may not include these strategies. I see a lot of powers of attorney where people come in and they have included the post-2011 stuff, but they have to be specifically initialed. And the lawyers don't encourage them to initial it because it sounds kind of scary. Make gifts, move money around, designate beneficiaries, and a lot of people just don't do it. But the reality is they may mean we can't do some of this planning for you when the need arises. So my general advice when we talk about power of attorney is grant as much authority as you can, right? I like to call it a skeleton key. Grant the authority and hope you never need it, then need it and not have it, right? So what I say is the most important aspect of a power of attorney is that you trust the person you're naming. Don't limit their authorities if you don't trust them. Don't name them. Find someone you can trust not to rob from you, not to take from you. You do not want to put someone who you have doubts about in this position. Find somebody who we can trust to do these things and give them as much authority as is reasonable so that they can help you when the need arises. When we look at some specific authorities we want to see for this type of planning, we want to look at unlimited gifts. We want to look at the ability to create an irrevocable trust like that qualified income trust I talked about earlier. We want to look at where it was executed. Is it Florida or is it out of state? Because if they come from Ohio, which I believe is not an income cap state, for example, and I'm picking on Ohio, but they're not an income cap state, so they don't require qualified income trusts. So a power of attorney executed there may not properly account for the fact that we need to do that under Florida law. So your out-of-state document may not be properly take that into consideration. When we look at who we name and how we name them, we can generally name agents in one of three ways. We can name them in order, so A, then B, then C, in that order. We can name them jointly, meaning A and B work together, or we can name them jointly and severally, which means either or. I don't care if it's my son or my daughter, whoever shows up to do it can do that job. So you do want to be thinking about who would I name and how would I name them? And are the people really the best people for the job, right? So when we look at our power of attorneys, we want to think about things practically, right? If my son was a hedge fund manager and great with money, but I can't get him on the phone, no matter what I try to do, I have to call his secretary and I get a call back 5 days later, that is not someone you necessarily want as your power of attorney if he's not available, right? Even if he is the best, right? You may pick your son who lives here, who, didn't go to college, but who's there whenever mom needs a hand and is trustworthy. Name that child who's available sometimes better than who's best educated for the job. So you really do want to think about who you name. I do like to tell the story that I had a real situation where a client came to me. She said, I want to name my oldest son. Not uncommon. I said, that's fine. He was going to come live with her. I said, that's great. That's a perfect person. I said, when is he going to come live with you? And she said, as soon as he gets out of prison, right? So that is a real story and a real cue. Maybe this isn't the best, and he was in there for theft, and it's right. So this may not be a person you want to give the keys to the kingdom to, right? If you're giving them access to your checking account, you want to wait till they're off probation before you're even considering them for that job. So you really do want to look at who the best person is for that. Next documents typically relate to healthcare. There are really 3 healthcare documents, 2 of which a lawyer does, 1 of which the doctor does. One is called an advance directive for healthcare. That's 99% of our medical decisions. Talking to doctors, consenting to surgery, treatment, rehab, medications, all the normal day-to-day medical decisions. The next part of that is that last 1% of decisions that have to be made sometimes, which commonly fall in the living will. And that's our end-of-life care, pulling the plug. Do we want artificial life support? Our document actually merges these 2 into one sort of healthcare packet, right? So your living will and your healthcare surrogate are in one packet. And our living will is broader than you might see other places, in that I like to say, I don't want to be the healthiest person in the dementia unit, right? So if I have advanced dementia and I don't recognize anyone and I'm staring off in the corner and I get ill, not only do I not want artificial heart, lung, nutrition, dialysis, those kind of machines, but I would authorize my wife, for example, not to treat pneumonia, right? If I have a serious illness that's going to end my life, if the treatment is only going to bring me back to another day of looking off in the corner, I don't want that care. So our living will authorizes the people we've named to make those decisions. Again, broader than you might see in a traditional living will. So make sure your living will does reflect your personal wishes. When we look at who we're naming here, again, we want to look at not just who might have a medical background, but it's most important to pick someone whose beliefs about medical care align with your own, right? So if you've got a daughter with a 28-year-old cat on dialysis, she may have a hard time pulling the plug when the time comes for you, right? We want to look at someone and say, what does this person's and maybe harder on the cat than they will be on you, but I don't know. But it's, we want to look and say, does this person's beliefs align with mine? If I don't want to be kept alive and this person is too sensitive or loves me so much that they can't imagine doing that job, then you don't name that person, even if they're the closest person to you in the world. If they don't align, we don't name them. I also like to say is you have to have this conversation with them. You have to tell them, these are my wishes and this is what I expect you to do. Can you do it? If they say to you, I don't want to talk about this. This is so morbid. This is, I don't want to do that, right? Which a lot of kids will do. You say to them, if you cannot have this conversation with me while I'm well, I cannot rely on you to make this decision when I'm sick. And so we have this conversation and I know your beliefs. or I will go back and name somebody else to do this job, because it's your life on the line, right? And it's important that you know that the people you've named have the both ability and willingness to hear you out and make these difficult choices. But also it's a gift to them to have this conversation, because no one wants to be in the position where they ever have to pull this plug. But the more I know I'm doing it because it's what my mom and dad wanted versus what I'm just deciding because we never talked about it, the better I'm going to be able to feel about the choice. My mom said she did not want to be kept alive artificially on life support. So yes, doctor, pull the plug, versus I guess I'm going to pull the plug on my mom because I don't know what she would have wanted. So have the conversation. That is a gift to your family. There is a thing that went around, and it's the right time of year to talk about it. The Senior Friendship Center said, talk turkey, right? Have this conversation at Thanksgiving. Have the hard conversation. You're all together. You tell them and you say, this is what I want. I want you to hear it from me. We'll go back to the cranberry sauce in a minute, but we're having this hard conversation so you know what I want if something happens to me tomorrow. Because life doesn't give us that warning, right? We don't know. We can't wait till we're sick to do this. You know, a lot of folks say, well, I don't want to be here. I'm going to off myself, right? You hear that from a lot of guys especially, right? I'm never going to be in that situation because I'm not going to. You say that now, you won't remember by the time you have Alzheimer's that you said it, right? And so have the conversation while you can. The other document that's not on here that we don't do as lawyers is that DNR, or do not resuscitate order. That is not something that's usually prepared by your lawyer. It's prepared by your doctor. It's a medical prescription. And the difference between a DNR and a living will in very broad terms is the DNR, the living will says, if you get me to the hospital and I'm not going to get better, do not do anything extraordinary. The DNR says, don't take me to the hospital. I don't want the treatment. I don't want the CPR. I don't want any intervention. Don't touch me, basically. Let me go where I fell and let me pass. It is the very most extreme version of these documents that you can have, and you do not want to have it until you are ready for that. A lot of folks come in, and it amazes me that their doctor has signed a DNR. They say, well, I have a DNR, you know, and they're 70 years old, they're otherwise healthy. And I said, so if you had a heart attack today, right now, would you want me to call 911 and have them perform CPR until they could get you to the hospital? Well, yes. Well, then you are not ready for a DNR. A DNR is only when you are ready not to be resuscitated or have CPR or have intervention.